Nobody in that house trusted the new pharmacist. Not the bodyguards posted at the front gate, not the housekeeper who moved through the hallways like a ghost, and certainly not the man who owned everything inside it. Nadia Korev had been warned before she accepted the position. A colleague from her residency program at Johns Hopkins had pulled her aside in the parking garage, voice low, eyes scanning the row of cars behind them. "The Mercer family doesn't hire from agencies," he'd said. "When they call you directly, it means someone already died." She took the job anyway. She was 29, 3 months out from finishing her clinical pharmacy doctorate, and her mother's medical bills had a way of making a person practical. The estate sat outside Charleston, South Carolina. 15 acres of old money and newer violence, wrapped in Spanish moss and wrought iron. The house itself was antebellum on the outside, gutted and rebuilt on the inside, with security cameras that tracked her every time she walked from the converted carriage house where she slept to the main residence where she worked. The medical suite occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor. It had better equipment than most private clinics she'd seen, and at the center of it, in a hospital-grade adjustable bed surrounded by monitors that beeped in quiet, patient rhythms, lay a man named Edmund Mercer. He was 63 years old. The patriarch of the Mercer Syndicate, a name that didn't appear in newspapers but showed up in federal case files that were quietly shelved every few years. He'd suffered a stroke 6 weeks before Nadia arrived. His left side was partially paralyzed. His speech was slow, deliberate, as though each word cost him something. But his eyes were sharp as glass, and they followed her around the room from the moment she walked in. His son ran things now. Rourke Mercer was 38, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that wasn't peace, it was control. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The staff moved around him like water around a stone, reshaping themselves to avoid friction. He wore his suits the way other men wore armor, and he looked at Nadia the first morning she arrived. The way you look at something you're still deciding whether to trust. "My father's previous pharmacist retired," he told her, standing at the entrance to the medical suite, arms crossed, blocking enough of the doorway that she had to angle past him to enter. "Retired," she repeated, 6 weeks ago. The timing, she noted, matched exactly when Edmund had his stroke. She didn't say that out loud. Her job was specific. Manage Edmund's medication regimen, liaise with Dr. Harmon, the attending physician who came every Tuesday and Friday, and document everything. She was not to discuss Mr. Mercer's condition with anyone outside the medical team. She was not to bring a personal phone into the medical suite. She was not to alter any prescription without Dr. Harmon's written authorization. She agreed to all of it. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed legitimate. Edmund's stroke recovery followed a predictable pattern: slow improvement in fine motor function, speech therapy twice a week via a therapist named Mr. Vasile, who came highly recommended and never made eye contact with anyone. Nadia managed his blood pressure medications, his anticoagulants, his supplements. She kept meticulous logs. She double-checked every dose, and she noticed things, small things at first. The way Dr. Harmon hesitated when she asked about Edmund's baseline blood pressure readings from before the stroke, readings she couldn't locate in the file she'd been handed. The way the medication log she inherited had 3 weeks of entries in handwriting that wasn't consistent. The same person supposedly writing, but the pen pressure changed. The letter formations shifted. The way Edmund, on the mornings she arrived early, seemed more disoriented than on mornings she arrived at the standard time. She told herself it was coincidence. Stroke recovery was non-linear. Different staff handled morning medications on different days. Handwriting changed under stress. She made herself smaller and kept watching. It was a Thursday. Dr. Harmon wasn't due until Friday when she saw it. She'd come in at 5:45 in the morning, earlier than usual, because she'd woken at 4 and couldn't return to sleep, her mind running calculations she couldn't name yet. The night attendant, a man named Pryor, looked startled to see her. He left within minutes of her arrival, faster than his shift technically required. Edmund was awake. He looked at her, and something moved in his expression. Something that wasn't relief exactly, but was adjacent to it. Early, he said. The word came out slow, like he was lifting it. Couldn't sleep, she told him, and pulled up the medication chart on the tablet by his bed. The morning dose of metoprolol, his blood pressure medication, had already been administered. Pryor had logged it at 5:30. She cross-referenced the pharmacy stock count automatically, the way she always did, a habit she'd built so deep into herself that she barely thought about it anymore. The count was off. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have jumped out at anyone who wasn't specifically looking for discrepancies in a 28-day medication log. One extra tablet, unaccounted for, but only if you compared it against the delivery receipt from 12 days ago and the running tally she'd been keeping in a separate notebook she kept in the inside pocket of her lab coat. A notebook no one knew about. She stood still and breathed. Then she pulled up Edmund's vitals trend from the past 3 weeks. She wasn't supposed to have full access to the monitoring system. Her clearance was limited to the pharmacy side of his care. But the cardiologist who'd configured the system had used a default secondary password that she'd noticed, written in pencil on a post-it note stuck to the inside of a cabinet door in the supply closet. She'd memorized it the first week and said nothing. The blood pressure data told her something Dr. Harmon's weekly summaries hadn't. Edmund's pressure was spiking episodically. Not randomly, episodically. There was a pattern. The spikes clustered in the early morning hours, specifically on mornings after Pryor's overnight shifts. They were brief, sharp, and then resolved. They didn't look like stroke complications. They didn't look like medication failure. They looked like medication interference. She set down the tablet and looked at Edmund. He was watching her. "How long have you felt worse in the mornings?" she asked. He blinked. The left side of his face moved slowly. "Always," he said. Then, "Not always. When did it change?" His eyes drifted toward the door. She understood that. She took the unused tablet she'd been tracking, pulled it from the organizer tray, sealed it in an evidence bag she fashioned from a sterile specimen bag from the supply cart, and labeled it with the date, time, and her initials. She tucked it into her notebook pocket. She didn't say anything to anyone. Instead, she started arriving at 5:15 every morning. Pryor adjusted. He started logging the medication administration at 5:10. She arrived at 5 o'clock. He was clever about it. He'd shift slightly earlier every time, never so dramatically that it looked like avoidance. But she was more patient than he was. On the 11th day of this silent adjustment, she arrived at 4:50 and found Dr. Harmon inside the medical suite. At 4:50 in the morning. Dr. Harmon was 61, silver-haired, with the particular authority of a man who'd spent decades being the most credentialed person in any room he entered. He wore a look of measured displeasure when he saw her. Not quite shock, not quite anger. The kind of face a person makes when they're deciding how to handle an unexpected complication. "Miss Korev," he said, "you're very early." She kept her voice level. "I wasn't aware you had a scheduled visit." Edmund's pressure was flagged remotely. "I came to check on him personally." She looked at Edmund. He was awake, but he looked dazed. The specific fog she'd started recognizing, the kind that appeared on certain mornings and then cleared by mid-afternoon. "I'll take over from here," Dr. Harmon said. "A statement, not a suggestion." "Of course." She smiled, moved to the supply station, and began her standard morning inventory with the careful efficiency of someone had absolutely nothing to hide. She stayed in the room. Dr. Harmon waited for her to leave. She didn't. He administered nothing and left 14 minutes later with the particular tension of someone controlling a significant irritation. She watched the security camera in the hallway. Its angle was posted on the estate map she'd memorized her first week. Track him toward the main entrance. Then she looked at Edmund. "He was going to give you something," Edmund said. "Not a question." "I think so." He exhaled. Something about his posture shifted, a loosening barely perceptible, like a man who had been holding his breath for weeks. "My son," he said. "Tell Rourke." She'd been hoping he wouldn't say that. Not because she doubted Edmund, but because walking into Rourke Mercer's office with an accusation against his father's physician and an indirect implication about his night attendant with nothing but a specimen bag and a handwritten notebook as evidence, was not a conversation she'd been looking forward to. Rourke Mercer's office was on the second floor, northwest corner, overlooking the front drive. She'd been in it twice, once for her initial interview, once when she'd been summoned to sign additional NDAs 3 days into her employment. Both times, she'd had the unnerving sensation of being evaluated on criteria she wasn't fully aware of. She knocked. "Come in!" He was standing at the window. He turned when she entered, not quickly, the way startled people turn, but fully, deliberately, giving her his complete attention. His eyes moved to her lab coat, her hands, her face in that order. "You're not on schedule," he said. "No." She closed the door behind her. "I need to show you something." She put the notebook on his desk. She put the specimen bag next to it. She stood back and let him look, because she'd learned in the past 3 weeks that Rourke Mercer was not a man who liked information delivered in a pre-packaged narrative. He liked to see the evidence and form the shape of it himself. He picked up the notebook. He read it, not skimmed it, read it, line by line, going back twice to the section where she'd charted the episodic pressure spikes against Pryor's shift schedule. His expression didn't change much, but something in the quality of his stillness did. "Dr. Harmon was there this morning," she said. 4:50. "No scheduled visit, no prior notification to me. Your father was already showing signs of the same morning confusion pattern. Dr. Harmon said he'd come because of a remote pressure alert, but I've been the one monitoring the remote system, and no alert was sent." Rourke set the notebook down. He looked at the specimen bag. The tablet. It was logged as administered at 5:30 the morning of the 15th, but the stock count doesn't support that. I believe Pryor logged a false administration and diverted the actual medication. What he gave your father in its place, I don't know yet. I'd need independent lab testing to confirm. You'd need to get that tablet out of this house. Yes, he looked at her. A long, measuring silence. You've known something was wrong for how long? 11 days. She paused, possibly longer if I'm honest. But I needed the pattern to be definitive before I came to you. Why come to me at all? He wasn't challenging her. He genuinely wanted to know. You could have called the police, the state medical board, a dozen regulatory agencies. She'd thought about that. She'd thought about it hard, lying awake at 3 in the morning with the numbers running in her head. "Because your father is still in that room," she said. "And if I'd made a call that triggered an external investigation before I understood the full scope of what was happening, whoever is behind this would have had time to clean up the evidence, including your father." Something moved behind Rourke's eyes. Not softness. He didn't seem built for softness. Something more like recognition. "And you trust me," he said slowly. "I trust that you want your father alive." He walked to his desk, picked up his phone, and made 2 calls. The first was short, 3 words she couldn't make out. The second was longer. He spoke in a low, measured voice, and the only words she caught were a name Aldrich and the phrase, "Do it quietly." He set the phone down. "Pryor won't be on the estate by noon," he said. "I need you to write down exactly what you told me in detail, with timestamps. Everything in that notebook, plus what you observed this morning. Don't leave anything out. And Dr. Harmon?" "Dr. Harmon will have a conversation with people whose questions are harder to avoid than mine." A pause. "The tablet needs to go to an independent lab. I have someone who can handle that without it coming back to you or to this estate. I'd like to keep my own copy of the chain of custody." He looked at her. "Of course you would." There was something in his voice she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't amusement, but it wasn't irritation either. "You've been building a parallel record this whole time. It seemed prudent." It was. He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "You slept here 11 nights knowing something was wrong in this house. 12, actually. And you didn't run." She thought about her mother, about the bills, about the colleague in the parking garage and the way she'd driven home from that conversation, and sat in her car for 40 minutes before she'd accepted the call from the Mercer estate. "I had reasons to stay," she said. "So did whoever is doing this." He said it without anger, which somehow made it land heavier. "Find out who's paying Harmon, and I'll consider us even on what I owe you." She blinked. "That's not part of my job description." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." What followed was 9 days that Nadia would later find almost impossible to describe to anyone. Not because she'd signed documents that prohibited it, though she had, but because the interior logic of those days had its own particular texture that resisted ordinary language. She continued her work in the medical suite. She continued her medication logs, her stock counts, her careful documentation. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, everything did. The laboratory results came back in 4 days through a channel she didn't ask about. The tablet that had been diverted from Edmund's morning dose had been replaced with something else, a modified release formulation of a calcium channel blocker that, in a man of Edmund's age, weight, and current cardiovascular profile, would have caused a cascade of complications. Gradual, deniable, consistent with stroke recovery going badly. It wasn't intended to kill him quickly. It was intended to make him look like he was simply failing to recover. She read the results twice, sitting at the supply station with Edmund asleep 6 feet away, and felt the cold, precise shape of premeditation settle into the room around her. She presented the findings to Rourke that evening. She put the lab report on his desk next to the original specimen bag receipt. She walked him through the pharmacology, the absorption rate, the interaction with Edmund's existing anticoagulant therapy, the projected timeline. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "How long would it have taken if the dosing continued at the rate I was tracking?" 8 to 12 weeks. He would have declined steadily. By the end, it would have looked like organ failure secondary to stroke complications. Anyone reviewing his chart would have found it consistent. Anyone who wasn't you. Anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. He stood and walked to the window, the same window he'd been at the morning she came to him. His back was to her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. Not the surface tension of anger, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from understanding the full weight of what someone tried to take from you. "Harmon has been my father's physician for 19 years, he said. She said nothing. There was nothing useful to add to that. Who's behind him? She'd spent the 9 days thinking about this. She'd pulled every piece of documentation she could access. Invoices, visitor logs, pharmacy delivery records, and built a picture from the negative space of what was missing. Your father signed an amendment to the family trust 11 weeks ago, before the stroke. I found the notary timestamp in a folder that was misfiled in the pharmacy records. I don't think anyone realized it was there. She put a single photograph on the desk, a photocopy she'd made on the estate's document scanner during a window, when the security log showed the camera in that hallway was on its 15-minute maintenance cycle. She'd been waiting 3 days for that window. The amendment removed a significant asset transfer that was previously scheduled to pass to an indirect beneficiary, someone with a vested interest in Edmund being incapacitated before the new terms could be executed. Rourke turned from the window and looked at the photograph. His jaw tightened. It was the first genuinely uncontrolled expression she'd seen on him, and it lasted less than 3 seconds before he reassembled himself. The name on the document was one she recognized from the estate's visitor log. A man who'd come twice in the past 6 weeks, signed in as a business consultant. He'd had access to the medical suite on his second visit, under the escort of Dr. Harmon. She knew from the body language with which Rourke absorbed this information that the man on that document was someone close to the family. He didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. "You recorded the conversation with Harmon this morning," he said. It wasn't a question. She reached into her lab coat pocket and placed a small digital recorder on the desk. The same model she'd ordered to the estate address 4 days after she arrived, under a supply order for a handheld barcode scanner, at the bottom of an itemized list of 8 other items. It had arrived in a plain equipment box, and she'd kept it in her notebook pocket since. Rourke looked at the recorder. He looked at her. "You came prepared for a different job than the one I hired you for." "I came prepared for the job I figured out this one actually was." Whatever he said next, she hadn't expected it. "My father asked about you," he said, "last night. He asked if you were going to stay." She didn't answer immediately. "He said you talk to him," Rourke continued. "Not at him, not around him. You talk to him like a person. He is a person. He's been treated like a liability for 6 weeks. He said it quietly, and the quietness was its own kind of devastation. By people he trusted. People I trusted. A pause. "I should have seen it." "You weren't looking in the right place," she said. "People who do this, they rely on proximity. They count on the fact that the person closest to the situation has the hardest time seeing it clearly." He looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you considerably more than I said before. You owe me my salary and a good reference," she said. "That's what was in the contract." The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely anything, less than a smile, more than nothing. "The man in that document will be handled," he said. "Harmon's medical license will be the least of what he loses." He picked up the recorder. "This stays with me." "A copy of it doesn't," she said. "I kept one." He set the recorder down and looked at her with an expression she'd been cataloguing since the first morning she arrived. That particular combination of assessment and something she'd only recently started identifying as respect. "Of course you did." Edmund Mercer's recovery, once the interference was removed and his actual medications restored, was slower than it might have been. Damage had been done. Weeks of episodic pressure events had taken something from him that wouldn't fully come back. But he stabilized. He started eating breakfast sitting upright in the chair by the window instead of in bed. He started watching the news in the afternoons. He started making dry, slow-delivered comments about the coverage that made Nadia laugh despite herself. The man in the photograph was gone from the family's orbit within a week. She didn't ask how. She understood enough by then to know there were questions that didn't need answers she'd have to carry around. "Doctor, Harmon's license was suspended pending investigation by the State Medical Board, a process that Nadia had quietly initiated herself, through a formal complaint filed through proper regulatory channels dated 2 days after she'd given Rourke the evidence. She'd told him about it after the fact. He hadn't objected. He'd given her a look she couldn't entirely read. Pryor had disappeared before she ever learned his last name. 3 weeks after the morning she'd walked into Rourke's office with a notebook and a specimen bag, Edmund called her to his bedside and looked at her with those glass-sharp eyes and said, very clearly, "Why did you stay?" She thought about giving him the practical answer. The one about her mother's bills and the salary. It was true, and it would have been enough. Instead, she said, "Because I could see something was wrong, and walking away from it didn't feel like something I could do." Edmund nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Good," he said. "That kind of thing is hard to find." She didn't know, standing in that room on that particular morning, with the light coming through the tall south-facing windows and the monitors keeping their patient, steady rhythm, what would come next. She knew she'd stay until Edmund's recovery was stable enough to transfer his care to a long-term team. She knew Rourke would knock on the door of the converted carriage house that evening and stand in the doorway longer than any practical conversation required. She knew the estate would feel different now. The specific quality of its silence had changed, the way the air changes after a storm moves through. She knew she'd built something in those 12 sleepless nights that had nothing to do with the contract she'd signed. She pulled the chair to Edmund's bedside and sat down, and they watched the morning come through the window together, without anyone in the room needing to explain anything at all.